Explore the presidencies of Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. Welcome to the Presidential Files, Nixon and Ford. We go back in time to before Nixon was president. Richard Milhouse Nixon was born in 1913 in Yorba Linda, California. Growing up, he was poor, but through hard work graduated from Whittier College and received a full scholarship to Duke University Law School. After working as a lawyer, he entered the Navy, serving as a lieutenant commander in the Pacific during World War II. He then returned to civilian life, served as a senator and representative, before being elected as the 37th President of the United States in 1968, serving in the Oval Office from 1969 to 1974. Nixon came into office. He wanted to turn America into a more conservative nation, introducing new federalism, distributed a portion of federal power to state and local governments. This introduced revenue sharing, which allowed state and local governments to spend federal dollars in whatever way they saw fit, within limitations. He also tried to overhaul welfare by creating the Family Assistance Plan, which gave every family of 4 or more with no outside income federal financial support. To create support in the South, he created the Southern Strategy. This attracted Southern conservative Democrats by appealing to their unhappiness with federal desegregation. Nixon offered a practical solution. New federalism allowed locally controlled segregation. The Nixon administration created biracial committees whose task was to regulate desegregation in this area. This was effective at the time. He also promised to name a Southern Supreme Court official. Nixon supported many movements occurring in this time period. He created a presidential task force on women's rights, and after the great success of Earth Day in 1970, he pushed for the Clean Air Act to be passed the same year. Under Nixon's administration, the country faced stagnation, which is high inflation and unemployment, which was partially caused by the dependency on foreign oil that belonged to OPEC. Although achieving a few things domestically, President Nixon's major successes were in foreign relations. With his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, Nixon also eased hostility with China and the Soviet Union. He secretly sent messages to Chinese officials when tension between China and the USSR was growing, in order to open up dialogue. In 1970, he reduced trade restrictions with China as well. In turn, Chinese officials invited the American table tennis team for a competition. This will later be referred to as ping-pong diplomacy. In 1972, Nixon visited China and engaged in direct talks with Mao Zedong, the Chinese communist leader at the time. This pressured the Soviet Union into better relations with the US. The same year, he visited Moscow and met with Leonid I, the Soviet Union's leader at the time. Nixon successfully negotiated the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT, with the Soviet Union, preventing them from producing strategic missiles capable of carrying nuclear arms.
Well, Nixon proposed a strategy called Vietnamization, in which he replaced American soldiers and troops with Vietnamese soldiers, hereby effectively ending U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War.
While Nixon was very successful in ending the Vietnam War, for which he is quite well known today, his presidency is largely overcast by the Watergate scandal. Burglars connected to Nixon's re-election campaign were arrested in the Watergate office of the Democratic National Committee. They had attempted to wiretap phones and steal documents. Nixon attempted to cover up and stop the FBI from investigating, but Nixon's time in office was running out. When his role came to light, he resigned to avoid impeachment. As he became the only U.S. president ever to resign, he handed off the presidency to his vice president, Gerald Ford.
Gerald Ford was born in Omaha, Nebraska on July 14, 1913. He attended the University of Michigan and studied law at Yale. He then enrolled in the Navy during World War II, later entering politics as a representative from Michigan, and was generally known as an honest and likable man.
This is an hour of history that troubles our minds and hurts our hearts.
In order to fight the inflation and energy crisis of the country at the time, Ford passed the Whip Inflation Now program, in which he called upon citizens to cut back oil and gas usage and practice energy-saving methods. However, this plan failed due to a lack of incentive. Ford also adopted a tight money policy in which he cut back on government spending. Ford further improved the U.S.'s relations with China and the Soviet Union, heavily relying upon Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. He achieved the Helsinki Accords, which was an agreement signed in Helsinki, Finland by the US, Canada, and all of Europe that established boundaries of post-World War II Europe, protected human rights, and ultimately reduced tensions between Eastern and Western Europe. And the Apollo-Soyuz joint manned spaceflight, which ended the space race between the US and the USSR. He also made attempts to improve relations in Asia, making trips to both China and Japan. A major controversial event during Ford's presidency was the rescue of a U.S. merchant ship, the B.I.G, which had been captured by communist Cambodia. While the rescue did save all 39 crew members, 41 U.S. troops died in the effort, and some argue that the price had been too high. While President Ford made great attempts to solve problems at home, he was unsuccessful in preventing the worst economic recession in 40 years. He was also remembered for pardoning ex-President Nixon for his crimes in the Watergate scandal, which outraged many Americans and severely decreased Ford's popularity among the public.